From the Homestead Studios in Santa Clarita, California, it's just the Tip-Sters with Melissa Morgan.
Color outside the lines.
If you've got a tip for Melissa, that place you know about where that thing is, that thing you know about that your family never wants to discuss, the location of the goddamn restrooms on the Starship Enterprise, anything, tell us about it by calling the Tip-Ster hotline at 832-TIPSTER. That's 832-847-7837, or send an email to jttipsters@gmail.com. You just might hear your tip on the podcast. And now here's your host, digging deep until her shovel hits the truth, at least until the property owner issues a restraining order, Melissa Morgan.
More cowbell. What are you, some kind of bathroom nerd?
Well, I was just, I've been watching all these old Star Trek shows.
Uh-huh.
Well, not old ones. I've been a fan of the original Star Trek and Star Trek The Next Generation. That was about it. Okay. And okay, yeah. I just, because they released this new thing called Picard, which is off of The Next Generation.
Does that have Baby Yoda?
No. Anyway, I subscribed to the CBS All Access.
Baby Yoda's
thing.
Cute.
He's very cute.
He's
but
so cute.
He's not on the no.
No, he's not on that.
So anyway, I'm watching Picard, which you have to watch every week. And so in the meantime, I'm watching all these other Star Trek shows, these spin-offs that they've been doing. And I just occurred to me while I'm watching, nobody ever goes to the bathroom. Where's the head?
They go when they're in that thing that takes your molecules and puts you on another thing.
Oh,
transposer.
When they're being transported.
Transporter. Yeah, so that thing. They go there.
It makes you shit into
and then it dissolves
into outer space or something.
And then, right. And then because outer space is just a giant toilet. Okay, we're done now. I don't care where they go to the bathroom.
Okay.
You fucking weirdo.
Sorry.
They have it's formed into those blue ice things like they have in airplanes, and then they release it somewhere over Iowa and hope it doesn't hit some woman in the head with their blue ice shit crystals.
They make it so it crashes onto the Klingon home planet.
Yeah, sure. That's it. They aim it. They use those T-shirt cannons.
Yeah.
And just shoot big blue frozen ice things of shit and piss from Picard.
I see.
And
all
Whoopi
right.
Goldberg and Baby Yoda.
Okay.
They all go.
All right.
Pew 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 or whatever. I don't know the noises that it makes. I'm not good with.
We're getting way off track.
You know what? I think I'm just hungry. I don't know what's happening.
So
but
you're hungry and you're thinking about blue ice packs full of shit.
Yeah.
That's great.
Well, doesn't everyone use something like that to spur them on to lose weight?
If anybody ever wonders if we plan these intros, now you know
this
that
is
we
a really
don't.
good example.
Now that you just know we don't.
I know nothing about what he's going to say, which is a blessing. And apparently he doesn't know what we talk about on the podcast. Okay. So that's good too.
All right then.
So this episode I am really excited about and so grateful to Scott Howard. So some of you know in my previous life, I managed a couple of comedy clubs, one in California here and two in Cincinnati and Covington, Kentucky. And the one in Cincinnati, Go Bananas, we had, a booking agent who would put acts in, and I would either, after they were there for a week, I'd say, yeah, they can come back, or no, they can't. And Elroy Bondo, which was a duo, I don't like duos and I don't like jugglers. And yet Scott and his partner Russ were just great guys, just the greatest of guys. And their act was hilarious, which is the thing that mattered, is that it was funny. They were smart and funny. And if you're familiar with the Flying Karamazov brothers that would, juggle like knives and stuff, instead of 4 or 5, there's just these 2 guys, and they were hilarious. And we've stayed in contact, through the blessing of social media, and Scott lives in Colorado. And he sent me a message a couple of weeks ago and said, are you familiar with Peggy Hettrick? And I'm like, no, I don't know what that means. And it's Peggy Hettrick, Hettrick. And Scott was one of the last people, other than her murderer, to see her alive. And he is an integral part in setting up a timeline for detectives to figure out what happened to her, because it's such an unusual and bizarre case, and for many, many reasons. And there's a lot of details that aren't going to be in this episode because of our discussion with Scott, it's more about what he knew and what happened, and it's too layered to do in one episode. It needs to be, it could be its own original television series.
Yeah,
honestly,
well, I think you covered the case pretty well in the interview.
I think we hit the high points. There's a lot of fine, small details that make it even more interesting, but let's just say it was a complete miscarriage of justice. Someone who had nothing to do with anything was convicted and spent 8 or 9 years in prison, and actually won a lawsuit after he was released. And I think that was the part that Scott was wanting to be known, is that, justice was finally served when Tim Masters was proven to not be Peggy Hettrick's murderer. And it's a fascinating case that is absolutely probably used as a teachable moment for many people in law enforcement and forensics. It's an amazing case. It's really, really fascinating. And the anniversary of it was just, by the time this episode airs, it will have been a week and a half or 2 weeks after it happened. But it was just such an odd thing that out of the blue, Scott messages me on Instant Messenger and says, I know, you host this podcast and this case might be interesting. And I was able to provide a timeline, and I'm like, well, hello, you're definitely coming on for us to talk to. And he is a fantastic guest. And he, after we got done with this episode, mentioned another case that is pretty fascinating that we will be talking to him about in the coming months. So I'm now beginning to wonder if he's just like a professional witness.
I'm starting to get a little, I don't know.
He's an interesting guy. So I hope you will enjoy this interview with Scott Howard for the Peggy Hettrick case. So we are really blessed today to have an eyewitness to a fascinating unsolved case. And I was so excited and yet a little bit confused. So a little background. I used to manage a comedy club in Cincinnati, and Scott Howard and his partner, Russ, were a fantastic act called Elroy Bondo. And I do not like jugglers, and I don't like duos. And yet I loved both. I loved both of these boys with all of my heart. They, the closest thing I can, and Scott might correct me, the closest thing I can really compare you guys to was the Flying Karamazov brothers. And I loved,
very good.
Yeah, I loved them very much as I was a kid, like watching them on Mike Douglas or whatever. And then I see, Elroy Bondo gets booked into our club, and I'm like, what the fuck is this shit? And then I watch them, and I'm like, oh my God, they're fucking awesome. And I do remember one of, I think your lines was that you would be juggling flaming garden weasels.
Correct.
Yeah. Oh my God. Are you kidding? You guys were the best. I loved watching you like every night. And as a club manager, you just want to make sure your staff isn't like stealing all the booze or doing whippets in the freezer. But so you don't spend a lot of time watching the acts. You might watch them the first night and the last night. But I watched you guys every night and just loved you because you were amazing. So here's these two really fascinating dudes who are touring stand-up comics. And, I'd met, when I was managing this club. And apparently you have this fascinating experience that happens. And then years later, I am hosting a true crime podcast. Ed Scott messages me, hilariously, by the way. I'm going to guess you used talk to text because you said, oh, are you familiar with the Peggy Hettrick case? And I'm like,
I've been spelling it, yeah.
I was like, no, does she play hockey? I don't know who the fuck's Peggy Hettrick? And then you just give me a little bit of details. I'm like, oh my God, of course, Peggy Hettrick. What a fascinating case. And you are intimately involved. So I can't wait to hear this. So innocent, sweet Scott Howard and Russ are at were you guys at the Laughing Dog or were you at the Prime Minister?
It was a steak restaurant called the Prime Minister.
The Prime Minister. Okay.
Yeah, the pun on Prime.
So you so you take it from here. Peggy wasn't found until February 11th in 1987, but you and Russ on February 10th were at the Prime Minister. So you take it from here. What happened?
So I'm pretty sure we were headlining that night. We do our show. Of course, they feed you before you go on. So
of course.
Instantly bloated with prime ribs, delicious steak. and you go up on stage and you do a sluggish set, which is how we always felt there. But afterwards, I will go to the bar, as comedians tend to do, to meet fascinating people and beautiful women. And I'm sitting at the bar, having some drinks, talking to the bartender, and a woman walks in. Of course, this is February. It was cold that night. She's bundled up, a stocking hat, kind of a camel hair coat, probably a scarf, bundled up. Of course, Prime Minister, this was down by the college, so it was a very young crowd, and this gal was not. I mean, she was maybe 10, 15 years older than myself.
She was 37. Yeah, she was 37, yeah.
At the time. Yeah, okay. So that sounds about right, 40-ish. Yep. And so she kind of stood out, as soon as she walked in, and she walked up next to me and kind of squeezed in to ask the bartender if she could borrow a phone.
Yes.
And the bartender obliges her, and she has him dial a number, and he passes her the receiver, and there's no answer. She gives it back to the bartender, and we start talking, and she reveals to me that she got home from work and had lost the key to their condo.
She had actually given the key to a sub-renter in her apartment, but I love this detail. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. So something about the key. She couldn't get in. She was trying to call her roommate at work. Of course, this is years before cell phones.
Right.
She was trying to get hold of. I think she was calling another bar someplace where her roommate worked to see if she could.
The Laughing Dog.
Meet her there.
Yep.
Okay, that's where the Laughing Dog came in. That sounds about right.
Yep.
And so she was calling, and she called 2 or 3 times, if I remember, and we chatted a little bit. I don't remember spending a lot of time with her. I kind of remember going on and mingling around the bar some more and seeing her sitting there at the bar most of the night. Of course, we were just waiting to get paid. As soon as you get paid, they always have to wait a couple hours. You know how it is after the show. And then we get paid, and I remember we go to our car, Russ and I. We get in our car, and we're about to drive to Denver, back to Denver, and Fort Collins is an hour away, and I look at the clock, a little digital clock in the dash, and it said 12:40. And as soon as I looked up, there was Peggy crossing the street to an empty field. There's this great big field next to the Prime Minister, probably maybe four square blocks. And then you could see the apartments that she was headed to were kind of on the southern side, kind of catty-corner, the Prime Minister, which the condo started. So she was going to cut across this field
to her ex-boyfriend's apartment.
Yeah.
Yep.
And that, so I see her, and I don't think twice about it, but I just remember noticing her. And we drive back home, and I get a call the next day or the day after from the Fort Collins police asking me about people I talked to at the Prime Minister, and I'm thinking, what did I do? Is some girl going to say something? What is going on? They explained to me that this woman was found murdered in the field that I had been speaking with, and I guess the bartender remembered, the juggler was talking to her.
The juggler. You sound like a Batman villain. The juggler was talking to.
Curse you, juggler! Curse you, sir!
Hey, I got that plenty already. So.
Did you
I was freaked out. I was surprised. I couldn't believe it that nice lady, ended like that. And of course, I was very. Anything that came up in the paper for years to this day about that case, I perk up and I read.
Sure.
Just because I know. And so what actually happened after that, I forgot about it for years. I mean, you just thought this was kind of this cut and dried murder. I remember the kid they accused. And then it became a bigger story after years later.
Yeah, like 10 years.
To this case, to this case that it is now. It's kind of a famous case.
Yeah.
And I'm still to this day surprised that about a lot of aspects of the case. The poor kid that they railroaded into jail. I remember at the time he was the main suspect, and that he had, drawings and these notebooks. I was a teenager too, and I had creepy goth drawings.
No kidding.
I was an artist.
Yeah.
I went to art school, so
right.
I had, books full of this stuff, and it probably would have been disturbing to some people if they looked through there.
Tough shit.
And that's just what it's teenage angst. That's
right.
What, horror movies are, marketed to these kids for that very reason, and I just remember thinking that doesn't prove anything. This kid is
right.
Most likely innocent. and they just hounded him for years. I thought they arrested him as, that month.
No.
But as I look back now, it took 10 years.
10 years.
Yeah,
it was
and
amazing. And the thing that stuck out about what you sent me is obviously, first of all, you had to have like crapped your pants when the cops call you the following day. Like, what the hell about a murdered woman? I'm sure you probably released your bowels or something, but I
was concerned. I probably had my voice.
I bet.
But I think back, it's like, why did they not, make me one of the suspects? I'm sure at first, everyone's a suspect.
Right.
And I was like the last one to see her alive. Of course, I was up on the short list, I'm sure.
Right.
But cops also, they do this every day. They can tell when people are lying to them. They can tell when facts don't add up and when facts do. And, and Russ, I remember being thankful that Russ was with me and I had some kind of alibi.
Right. Unless the two of you did it together.
Exactly, yeah.
And I just want to say, you and Russ were probably two of the most gentlemanly men I ever dealt with managing a comedy club. There's a lot.
Well, thank you.
There's a lot of dudes I would have put on a list that could have been suspects. You were not one, and Russ was not one. You guys were amazing. But when you sent me the message, you said they railroaded some poor goth kid because of his drawings. And I was like,
yeah. And
the thing is, I don't want to say that this is like late 80s, early 90s satanic panic, but I mean, okay, before I start railing on the cops, let's go back. So you and Russ are working this gig, and on hindsight, it must feel pretty weird to know that you two were two of the last people other than the murderer to see her alive. And she's walking across the field to go to her ex-boyfriend's home to see if he can let her in. This story is so weird and layered. So a timeline is Peggy Hettrick gets off work at the mall and at first she goes to the Laughing Dog and has a drink, and then she uses the phone there, tries to call. She can't get into her home because it's locked, and she had given her only spare key to the roommate, which is exactly the story you had told. She then goes to the Prime Minister and sees you and Russ and a few other people, borrows the phone again, calls several times. The roommate was drunk, by the way, and passed out. So she didn't answer the phone.
Oh, that's great.
The roommate was there, but didn't hear. And Peggy had gone to the house and banged on the door and couldn't rouse her, and then thought maybe the phone would. And so she used the phone at two different establishments, not getting a hold of the roommate ever. She had gone to her ex-boyfriend's home and left a note that said, "Don't be mad if I call you at 2 o'clock. 2 a.m. I'm locked out of my house." She went back to the Prime Minister and ran into the ex-boyfriend and his new girlfriend. Now, everything was supposedly, there was no animosity. They had remained friends. An odd thing that happens after her murder is that one of the things that helped exonerate Tim Masters is that Matthew Zellner, her ex-boyfriend, his DNA was found, touch DNA, not, fluid DNA, found in her underwear. Now that can happen, obviously, if you've been intimate with someone, even after you wash your laundry. There can still be, touch DNA. So,
I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's very odd, and it took 10 years this case, Mark, is like so awful. So when Scott sent me the message, I was like, I don't know Peggy Hettrick. I don't know is she a juggler? Does she do hats, or I don't know. And then I'm like, oh my God. So Mark and I had seen an episode of Cold Case Files on this case. And as ridiculous as it is that law enforcement assumed young Tim Masters killed Peggy Hettrick, I assumed Dr. Hammond had been arrested for her murder, forgetting the details of what happened. Do you remember when I messaged you back? I was like, I thought the doctor did it. And I really did think that that's what happened. So to refresh producer Mark's memory, Peggy is found in a field, like Scott just said, across from, or catty-cornered from the apartments and across from the prime minister, or whatever it's called. And she is not just murdered, and she was not sexually assaulted, but she was assaulted in a way that is so unusual that to assume that a 15-year-old boy who draws dark drawings, and by the way, Tim Masters is a really good artist. At the age of 15, he drew things that were, I mean, he could have been some huge, anime star. He drew really interesting stuff at the age of 15. I don't mean because of its, darkness, but because of its, intricacies and its creativity. Right. He was a really creative kid. And he was, a kid. And he's tiny. He's small and thin. He's known as Toothpick Masters.
Well, how was she found? What was unusual about her murder?
So let me explain. A bicyclist who's riding to work a few hours after Russ and Scott see Peggy Hettrick, named a really weird name like Langdon Linden or something. And I was like, they should have just arrested him for the murder because of his name. But he sees something in a field. And like a lot of people, when you see a dead body, especially one that's posed so bizarrely, you think it's a mannequin. You're like, I can't envision this as a human being. But this bicyclist sees a pool of blood on the curb down into the street and then notices the trail runs from that pool to the middle of the field where Peggy's body is. So he turns around, goes back home and actually finds a neighbor and uses their phone and calls 911. So she had been stabbed in the back under the scapula, and it took only a few minutes for her to die, but those few minutes had to be terrible because her lungs were filled, her left lung was filled with 1.5 quarts of blood. She basically bled out. The person had, but wait, Mark, it gets so much more awful. The person had stabbed her with such force with at least a 5-inch blade that it had splintered a rib. So not only did he stabbed her in the back, I'm guessing to incapacitate her. It's wintertime, like Scott said. She's bundled up in a really interesting, pretty print coat, and it has absorbed most of the blood. And he drags her, walking backwards, probably from under the arms. He drags her to the middle of the field, where he then cuts off her left nipple with precision and performs a vulvectomy, cuts off her clitoris with a V-shaped cut, cuts off her labia and vulva.
Oh, my God.
Yeah.
Wow. I had no idea these details.
Oh, Scott. So that's why I thought it was the doctor. So here's another reason. Why would a 15-year-old boy who's a really good artist and known as, Toothpick Masters, I get it. Peggy was small. Peggy was like 5'1", 5'2", and about 105 pounds. She was small. But she was literally about the same size as Tim Masters, but he was taller. I mean, he was a stick. And I don't know that he would have the strength, even as a young boy who's like under duress, to drag her and do all this. Not only that, but he didn't have the precision or the desire to kill a human being. But anyway, so all of this is pretty weird, pretty strange, and precise, very precise. These cuts, after examinations, even the coroner said these look like they're done by a surgeon. The only hesitation mark was on the nipple. There was a tiny hesitation mark, but then it became very precise and very fast. And the surgeon said the nipple could have been removed within 1 minute. And the other things, were done with precision. But the thing that killed her was the stab to the back. So I don't know if you have experience with, Fort Collins Police Department, but this Lieutenant Broderick, later on they assume, they do an investigation and say that he had broken no laws. I'm blown away that he got as much as he did pushed through, because, I have an interesting relationship with law enforcement in that there's just not a lot of gray for me. I'm real black and white in life anyway, but I worship a lot of law enforcement who do such an amazing job and work so hard to solve cases and to, serve and protect. And then I have this dislike of law enforcement that become monovisioned, and they almost become like a DA that only wants to get something in their solved column, even if it's wrong. So this 15-year-old kid happens to live in a trailer, and just a series of shitty events in Tim Masters' life. Just, I can't, he lives in a trailer that is abuts the field. Dr. Hammond lives in a new development that abuts the field in a 2-story, beautiful, brand new home. There's the bicyclist, and then there's her ex-boyfriend. So there's kind of a short list of suspects at this point, because now we know Russ and Scott have been eliminated because they're just,
I don't think you've eliminated them for me yet.
Look, Mark, they did a show. They're stuffed with prime rib. They're not in the mood to kill people.
Yeah, they probably had enough blood in the prime rib.
Yeah.
To satisfy your bloodlust. Yeah. Scott was eliminated, Mark.
Okay, so how was this kid implicated?
Well,
when comedians say they killed that night, that's not what they mean.
Exactly. It's a whole different term. Yeah, and I bet you did kill, but not in the term that the cops think. So
Exactly.
a series of shitty things happen. I got to be honest. It starts with his dad. His dad, Clyde, says, my son took a different route to school that morning. And the reason he took a different route is because something caught his eye in the field, and it was Peggy. And he thought it was a mannequin. So he then went on to school. He thought for sure it wasn't real. And it was so staged and so bizarre looking. Even the bicyclist said, I thought for sure it was a mannequin. It's not like that wouldn't have been, something that everyone would have thought. On first glance, it's 7 a.m. and he's on his way to school, and he's like, oh, I thought someone put it there as a prank. And then he went on to school. Now, in hindsight, he says, I wish I would have reported it, but he's 15. He doesn't know, he doesn't even think it's a human. He doesn't think it's a body. He thinks it's he thinks it's a mannequin. His dad, is like, yeah, he went a different route to school today. So then he becomes under the microscope because you can see her body from his trailer the same way you can see her body from Matthew Zellner's apartment, the same way you can see her body from Dr. Hammond's house. It's a big field, a big empty field with not a lot around it, and she's in the middle of it. It's understood that you can see her. So
I'm sure that kid was bullied too at school, being the kind of kid that he was.
Yeah.
I thought someone was, going to, give him some trouble. So he's going to go a different way.
Absolutely. Well, he thought that bullies at school had put her there to upset him. He actually, that was part of his statement, is that he said, I thought some guys who were bugging me at school put her there, put a mannequin there to upset me. It was, So on the 12th of February, the day after Peggy is discovered, they search poor Tim Masters' home because Clyde, his dad, has called and said, my son took a different route. Thanks, Dad. And they find a few things that are very upsetting. Not the drawings. The drawings are not a big deal for me. His mother had died 2 years to the day before that, unexpectedly, of an illness. It was the exact day that she had died. She was petite with red hair. Honestly, Tim Masters, as he got older, looks like he could have been related to Peggy Hettrick. He's kind of a ginger. Yeah, and he looked like he could have been related to her. He was small and, small frame, and he looked like he could have been her, if not her son, a nephew or something. They're like, he has 2,000 drawings of violent artwork, and it looks like, there's one drawing where someone's dragging a body backward, and they combed that trailer within an inch of its life and found zero evidence. There's no hair or blood. They took the drain traps out. They took his clothing. They went through his locker at school. He had a small knife collection. How many 15-year-old boys have small knife collections?
Every one of us.
Right. Most of them, and the murder weapon was a 5-inch blade, and a separate instrument was used for the sexual mutilation. So, i.e. a scalpel. So, he's they went up his butthole with a microscope, or as politely as Mark says, they gave him a colonoscopy. That's what he says when things are weird. He's much more polite than I am. So they gave poor Tim Masters at the age of 15 his first colonoscopy, and they questioned him for 6 hours with no attorney, age 15, and no parent present because his dad sounds like a big butt fucker. So 6 hours. And Tim is just like, I don't know what you're talking about. He doesn't crack. He doesn't get upset. He's like, I don't know what you're talking. I had nothing to do with this. So they take a break and then they come back and talk to him. And he says, he's got an interest in either being in law enforcement or being in the military, which, is foreshadowing because he goes into the Navy for 10 years and where they arrest him 10 years later after 10 years of serving in the Navy, or 8 years, I guess, in the Navy. So they're like, this kid did it. They give him a polygraph and it's inconclusive, which, after 6 hours of being grilled by the police at age 15 for a murder you didn't commit, inconclusive doesn't mean anything to me. Quite frankly, polygraphs don't mean much, but to me, and obviously not to anyone else because they're not admissible in court. So, it's a few years later, he graduates high school and he goes into the Navy. And then another strange thing happens in 1992. The police won't give this up. It's 5 years later, and they think he did it. They just will not give up. So they're interviewing his former, friends at school. And one of them says, in art class, Tim said that the body had been sexually mutilated. And they're like, oh my God, this is it. That was never released. The only person that would know this is the killer. So they go question him. And he goes, I told a friend in art class about that because I had another friend who was part of the Explorer Scouts that helped the police, and they were searching the crime scene. And one of the officers told the Explorer Scouts about the mutilation. And they checked the story. And it checks out. So it's now 1997, 2 years later, and they end up dropping that. But they won't give up. So then they get a forensic psychologist who says, oh, yeah, it's definitely this kid. He's never met him, never talked to him. Based on his drawings, they say this just shows someone this is the workings of a mind who would do that. So I'm hoping, Scott, that you have gotten rid of all your knives and your drawings because
they never searched me.
Yeah.
I can't believe this doctor guy, the psychologist, comes up and says this. I mean, this is the guy that's really at fault for this poor kid going to jail and causing all that kind of trouble.
You're right.
Probably missing the fact that they missed the real guy who ends up, the doctor who ends up killing himself.
That's right.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, I didn't know that.
Well, Scott just ruined it, but it's okay because everyone can find it. So in 1999, they bring charges, two arrest warrants while he's in the Navy in Philadelphia.
So this is 12 years after the murder.
Yeah, it's actually 1997, and then the trial's in 1999.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So 10 years after her murder, and after Tim has been in the Navy and is in Philadelphia, they issue two arrest warrants for murder. One of them is dismissed, and I don't remember why, but one of them sticks, and so they arrest him. And then in 1999, Scott's right, based on the testimony of Dr. Reed Malloy, they decide that, Tim Masters, did this weird thing because of his drawings. He knew to stab her in the back under the scapula that would kill her quickly. He, had another knife or scalpel, because it's very easy for 15-year-olds in Fort Collins to get scalpels who live in a trailer. And they convict him, and he's sentenced to life.
This is all on circumstantial evidence with no actual evidence.
You're exactly right. You're exactly right.
And I'm sorry, I'm just going to say this again. Will Sears on what?
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, there's a case near us, Scott, that has a lot more evidence than this, actual physical evidence that the DA is unwilling to bring to trial. But we have our fingers crossed because it's been 3 years, but they've done some new checking just 2 days ago. So I'm hoping maybe, but it's these things that are so, I mean, one of the original investigators retired, a female investigator, and started working for the Attorney General, and she's one of the reasons that the case got overturned. So anyway, we're gonna go back, and Scott is right. It was this doctor and a few other weird testimonies that were just, I mean, it's fiction. It's just really good fiction writing. That's the reason Tim Masters lost 8 years of his life in prison, 9 years of his life in prison. So in 2008, special prosecutors were assigned to the case, and they decided that, a lot of information, really good information, was not turned over to the original defense team. And we'll get to that great information in a minute. So the defense attorneys released evidence that, also said, look, this isn't him. There's touch DNA that we sent to the Netherlands that was found on Peggy's underwear, and it, excludes him. It completely excludes Tim Masters. It includes, her ex-boyfriend, Matt Neller, but they were intimate. It doesn't mean that he killed her. So it takes a long time for this to actually come about. But in January of 2008, a Colorado judge vacates his conviction and orders him released immediately. Now, the DA is like, look, we're not dropping all these charges, and we're going to decide if we're going to retry him and, blah, blah, blah. And then 3.5 years later, in June of 2011, finally, the Colorado Attorney General said, okay, he's no longer a suspect and he's exonerated. Now, I didn't...
Well, la-di-da.
After he's lost a lot of his life and under that cloud of suspicion, after he has joined the Navy and been an exemplary soldier and, it protected us. Yeah, that was delightful. So now, one of the things that I think Scott was so fascinated by was how much money he got, and I can't find that. So do you know how much money he got when he filed the lawsuit?
I could be totally wrong, but I really remember him getting a substantial in the millions.
Good.
From this, and I remember thinking, well, at least he got that.
Right.
To pay for his 8 years, which I thought was longer too. But I couldn't be mistaken. But I do remember thinking that. So
let's go over a few other details that are so upsetting and disturbing. I sound like Tommy Lee Jones. Your suspect's name is Dr. Richard Hammond. And he was an eye surgeon who lived in a 2-story home that was also abutting the field where Peggy was. And out his bathroom window, you could see his upstairs bathroom window, you could see where Peggy was. He could look out and see, where she was. So in 1995, 7 years after Peggy's murder, and several things have changed in his life, but he is considered this exceptional eye surgeon, surgeons who would have scalpels and stuff. He is reported by a babysitter because he has rigged a bizarrely intricate system to record women going to the bathroom because he is obsessed with vaginas.
Wow.
He has thousands of hours of women's vaginas, i.e., vulva, labia, etc., on homemade videotapes.
Wow.
He has rigged this system through the vents in the home. so that he doesn't have to be around to press a button to record it. But when you turn on the light switch, the recording starts in the toilet.
That is just brilliant and sick.
It's all of that. He has hours of vaginas of his young daughter's friends, of his wife's friends, of a pet sitter, of a house sitter, of any guests that came to the house. The ages ranged from 11 to 40 of women using the bathroom. And a babysitter reports this, and they find this intricate system. He has a storage facility where he has kept all of his homemade videotapes. And his wife, Becky, God bless her, because she's obviously been through some shit. I don't understand that stand by your man when you are shown the monstrosity of what your spouse can do. You know, they were married and had 2 kids, and she was a homemaker, and he was this very brilliant surgeon. Now, the scalpels you use as an ophthalmologist for surgical, are small, very small and intricate, but they have larger ones for, less delicate work, but it's very, very delicate work. And she gave, the scalpels you might use to remove someone's vulva. She gives this account of their life as, I make dinner from scratch. We wait till Rich gets home. We eat together. We don't really like television. So we stand around the piano and sing songs. And then we read books, and then we go to bed by 10:30.
Interesting.
She also had a sleeping problem and took sleep aids, which may have allowed her husband to hang around the Prime Minister and the Laughing Dog bars, after she has gone to sleep, and she didn't know he was gone, right? So he's arrested. He is out on bond. He calls his wife and says, I'm in a hotel and I'm going to kill myself with lethal injection. She talks him out of it, and they get him into a facility called Mountain Crest Hospital. He's checked in there. He's there for, a couple of weeks. The doctors are like, he is really depressed and suicidal. They work with him, and by the time he leaves, they're like, he has gradually improved. On the day that we let him out, we ask him, do you feel suicidal? No, I'm okay. He then checks into the La Quinta Inn and hooks up a IV of cyanide that's so strong it melted the skin off of his bones in his arm.
Oh, Jesus Christ.
So wow. He's dead from his own hand, from his own IV drip of suicide, and said, I hope the media is satisfied for their bloodthirst, in this case.
Wow.
Now, at what point during that was he ever considered, after they discovered the tapes, who went all of a sudden ding, hey, he lives in this field, maybe this is the guy that did Peggy.
And this is why Scott is brilliant. That was all kept from the defense and never brought forth in the trial.
Oh, they knew all this during the trial?
Yes.
Wow.
Wow, that's just...
that's the best question that you could ask. When was this known? 1995. When was Tim brought to trial? 1999.
Well, now I just looked it up, and Scott settled with Larimer County for $4.1 million.
Yes.
That's a nice settlement, and he deserved more than that for this.
He does. Thank you for looking that up. I couldn't find it, Producer Mark. Thank you for finding it. I knew that was one of the things Scott brought up that was so interesting, and I'm glad. He deserves. You're right. You don't get that time back, and you don't get your life back. They destroyed his life. I mean, it's up to him to make his life of what it is from here on out, but they fucking destroyed his life. So a doctor, after Dr. Rich Hammond has killed himself in this amazingly dramatic style in the La Quinta Inn, says, Rich was a sensitive, bright, capable person. He was suffering a tremendous narcissistic injury. Wah! I mean, who isn't? Fuck you. He must have been overwhelmed, realizing that all he would have in the face of the weeks and months to come is a helpless feeling of despair. And this pushed him to do what he did. The media attention. He had no place to go safely. I believe his case was tried in the media, and the verdict was carried out by Rich himself.
Yeah, wow.
Thank you,
the other question,
Doctor.
I know.
Yeah.
Is there had to have been other women? I mean, he wouldn't have just been like one and done, or I mean.
I don't. That's also a great question. I have no idea if Dr. Hammond killed other women. I don't know if. To me, you're right. It seems a little too precise to have only been the one victim, but I think that the practice cases are the videotapes. I think that was.
Well, yeah.
I think he spent a large amount of time doing research on the female anatomy because, his wife said, I mean, she wouldn't even admit that it's odd to take 2,000 hours of women shitting and pissing. She won't even admit that. She's like, our sex life was so vanilla. It was the most boring thing you could ever imagine. And quite frankly, he would never hurt anyone. He's a wimp.
Oh, God.
Okay, lady.
They had the most sensible suspect who then killed himself. Mm-hmm. And it's like, okay, well, yeah, we don't have him anymore. Let's just focus on Tim Masters.
I'll be honest. I don't think they even would have considered Dr. Richard Hammond a suspect. I mean, they
unbelievable.
What they said was he was looked at briefly and completely ruled out. Oh, really? On what basis? On what basis was he ruled out? Because you never let Tim Masters off the hook. You did crawl up his colon with a microscope. You talked to his, schoolmates who weren't even like really good friends, that just an offhanded comment in art class. She was sexually mutilated. How did he know that? Well, because shit gets out and the cops told the explorers. The cops are telling little kids, teenage kids who are scout explorers, processing the field. Oh, by the way, she was mutilated sexually. Do you think that's not going to get out? I mean, the fact that he knew that offhandedly because another kid told him sure doesn't mean that he killed her. And I mean, I never want to say something turns into junk science, but to say that a 15-year-old kid who drew, quote unquote, I loved Scott's quote to me in his message was spooky drawings. A kid who drew spooky drawings suddenly is this like mastermind criminal who knows how to perform a vulvectomy. These are the things, and this case will never be solved now because Richard Hammond killed himself. I mean, the police are still saying, well, we're not, done looking at Matthew Zellner. Really? From 1987?
Yeah, what's the point?
Right.
Well, I just hope, after he pays his attorneys, he probably gets about $2 3/4 million. I hope he's invested it wisely and doesn't have to work a day again in his life.
And I hope he never talks to his father again.
Yeah, unbelievable.
I just am so, I've never met anyone who was this close to a case, and I'm really grateful that you were not considered, that you and Russ, the nicest dudes in the world.
I have a question for you, Scott. Did the Fort Collins police ever ask you to come to Fort Collins to be interviewed in person?
No, there were two phone interviews. One, like I said, 2 days after, in which I kind of learned what had happened, and then there was like a follow up. I have a feeling. I was thinking about this the other day, as getting ready for this. There was a phone call several weeks later, maybe even 3 weeks later, where they kind of went over the same stuff. I think they had hit like an impasse at some point. It was a different detective. It's like, hey, I don't have anything. Maybe you look at this, and they passed it on to maybe another part of their detective bureau there, and they went back through to look at stuff. I kind of got the feeling they were just really looking for any little detail that was going to help them again, because it was a more thorough interview. But at no time did I feel like I was a suspect during that part. Just like, okay, here's what you said before. Is that true? Yeah. And I think it had a lot to do with I'm pretty sure I'm the one who kind of established when she walked into that field.
Exactly. What you said. Yeah, you provided a timeline. You were very important.
I kind of reaffirmed, obviously, they had talked to other witnesses, and this whole thing about the phone and her calling her roommate, and, I just kind of reaffirmed all of that was indeed the case, and that made up part of that whole, initial timeline of that night.
Did they ask you to testify at trial?
No.
That's interesting.
They told me to be willing to make myself available, and I was like, yeah. So, I'm in and out of town a lot, but I'm happy, whatever to do. And they never really contacted me other than the 2 interviews.
Well, you were an important part of this, even if you weren't, called to testify, you were an important part of this because you provided the timeline. And here's, I think, another little story about Scott that shows you he is an exemplary witness. We put the comics who played the Go Bananas up at a hotel called the Luxbury. And as I'm picking he and Russ up at the airport and driving him to the Luxbury, he says, "Oh, they put the B in luxury."
I don't remember that.
I do. Because I grew up with my mom saying, my mom was, imagine the 180 of me. My mom was polite and quiet. And if someone, was a little, extra, she would say, well, they put the B in subtle. So the fact that you said, well, they put the B in luxury, I literally almost shit in my own car. I was laughing so hard. So you're an exemplary witness and a fantastic human. And we can't thank you enough for coming on and telling your story because, man, is it fascinating. Thank you so much, Scott.
Well, thank you and all your amazing research. Like I said, I had no idea some of those details that you knew about. And that's just, it's a crazy, crazy case.
It is crazy, and I can't thank you enough for bringing it to my attention because I, honest to God, thought that the doctor had been convicted. I didn't know he'd killed himself. I didn't remember until I started doing the research, but thank you for telling me about the case. It's too interesting to not talk about, so thank you, Scott Howard.
Crazy the timing of it because we're celebrating the anniversaries of those
exactly
that night.
Exactly.
So, a few nights ago.
It was just a couple days ago.
Your next story, I could tell you about Scoop Daniels from Breckenridge, the lawyer that skipped town. I was the last one to see him too.
Okay, now I'm starting to get scared.
Okay. Well, I think
that's another podcast.
That's another podcast. Okay,
and a good. I know that one too. I know that story.
When you get back home, you're going to get another phone call from Melissa.
Okay. All right.
Thank you, Scott Howard. You're the best.
You bet. I had a great time.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Scott Howard, for coming on and talking to us. Because Peggy's case, I wish that it could be solved, and maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it still can be, but I feel like there were so many missteps along the way.
Well, lots.
Yeah.
And you know what? I just want to mention, so we don't forget, Scott was a tipster. And you can be too.
You are right.
You may think that you're not, but I'll bet if you search your memory, you're going to think of something that might be related to a case, and that's why we have our phone number and our email address, which
Please.
I'm sure Melissa would be happy to tell you what they are.
Absolutely. And you don't have to be a witness to a murder. You don't have to provide a timeline for a case. You might have a case you want to hear featured. Please feel free to call us at 832-847-7837. That's 832-847-7837, 832 Tip-Ster. You can email us at jttipsters@gmail.com, and we would be really happy to hear from you. And if you have a moment and would like to take the time to rate, review, subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you catch your pods, we would be even more grateful. We are nothing without you, and we are really grateful for you, our tipsters. And more cowbell.
And if you would like to support the podcast, go to patreon.com/justthetipsters.